if this doesn't work and if I fail at this, it will somehow make me unemployable for the rest of my life. Throughout my career, I've been thrown into situations where I was the youngest person in the room, often the only woman in the room, and the person with like the least experience. So I do think that from early on in my career, I got pretty used to being uncomfortable and needing to ramp up pretty quickly. This is a technology that's coming. We can't be scared of it. We have to learn it. This is coming, whether people like it or not.
From what I read, you were literally rejecting every single application.
I can't remember exactly the numbers, but thousands of people signed up the first week or so.
From that internal and external kind of dialogue in your head, how do you separate like this isn't working, we need to change?
I would say that
Eva, you've said something that I keep coming back to. You said that you don't think entrepreneurs are born, you think they're made. Could you unpack that?
Yeah, I would say that as a child, I never dreamed about owning my own business, being an entrepreneur. I grew up the child of two immigrants who both worked blue-collar jobs. And so I didn't have a lot of entrepreneurs or founders in my life. And my goal when I went to Queen's School of Business was to come out and get a job. And it really was later in life that I explored being an entrepreneur, thought about being a founder, even though I think there were some seeds when I was a child of having a bit of that like entrepreneur or founder mentality. I don't think that I was the stereotypical kind of, born a founder kind of person.
So when did you start believing that? Was there a moment that you can think to? And we'll go through kind of where Borrowell is in the origin story, but can you think about a specific moment when you were like, yeah, I'm an entrepreneur, I'm a founder?
That's a great question. I'm not sure if I did think about that before actually becoming one. So yeah, I don't think that that's sort of how I would have defined myself or how I would have said that's who I am.
Yeah. Well, and you were a mother before you were an entrepreneur, before you joined Borrowell. So let's go back to that and we'll pull this thread because I think it's such an important moment. When I was building my tech company, I felt tremendous, kind of like I didn't belong in these rooms, particularly a lot of male dominated rooms. Like that just kind of is the industry. And I felt like I had to kind of keep figuring out how I needed to show up in those rooms versus going, I can actually just show up truly as I am and build. So I love your story because you weren't putting this on some action vision board and going, I want to be, a founder and build wealth through entrepreneurship. It was more like, hey, well, actually, let's get into it. Let's talk about, first of all, where is Borrowell today? In 30 seconds, give us the picture, and then let's go back to the beginning.
So Borrowell is a Canadian fintech company. We have over 4 million Canadian members, and our mission is to help Canadians feel confident about money. We do that primarily by helping people understand their credit, build their credit, and use credit. So we have a couple of credit building subscription products that we have launched, and then we have a marketplace of financial products. And so we've got just over 100 employees and hundreds of thousands of people use our products every week, which is super exciting.
It's amazing. And you were first in Canada with Equifax as a partnership. You're on the Deloitte Fast 50. When you think about where you are today, what sort of comes to mind as a snapshot of like, oh, wow, okay, like we're waking up and here I am in your new role as Chief Product Officer as well. What excites you in this moment?
Yeah, I mean, today there's just so much excitement around AI, which I think it's sort of hard to not talk about, but it is super exciting. And I just think that things that were maybe 3 years in the future, we now think are possible within the year. So I think just in terms of being able to build, features and products for our members that will help them achieve that confidence when it comes to their money, is super exciting.
I would love to talk about AI as a portion of this. And I think we'd be doing a disservice to founders listening if we didn't at least kind of go like, how are you thinking about it? I was talking to a founder who was building an AI company. So pure AI first. And I was like, oh, is this feature going to be out in, in like, I don't know, a year? Because I'm used to being like, let me just like temper my excitement. And he's like, no, we can't move that slowly. Are you kidding? And it's like, okay, well, it's the pace. And I'm sure we all feel that. But let's go back to the very beginning of when Andrea approached you. Walk us through where you were. My understanding is you were on mat leave at the time, and this was kind of like a, hey, can we do a little project together for a couple of weeks? What was that moment for you?
Yeah. So my co-founder, Andrew Graham, we knew each other from before, and we had actually founded a not-for-profit together. And that was a great experience for me to, I think, understand what it might be like to be an entrepreneur, but in a really safe way, in that I still had my day job, but there was something really exciting about building something from scratch around casting a vision for a mission and recruiting people to join in, and then actually just building something. And so I think that for me was my first taste, and again, a pretty safe way. But
Yeah.
I do think that that's what gave me the confidence, again, with Andrew to say, hey, I know that we work really well together. I'm super excited about, the vision of Borrowell that he was pitching. And it was actually me who said, well, like, if I can't find another job, I'll just come and join your startup. And I expected him to laugh. Do you know what I mean? Like, haha, that's very
I love
funny,
that you asked that. Yeah.
Yeah. And he did it. He took me really seriously. And he just sort of said, well, what would you want to do? And I had no idea. I was like, I have no clue. Like, what is it that you need done? And one conversation led to another. He responded to that by saying, well, why don't I just give you the pitch for what the company is? And, and he's like, I have to practice it anyways. And I got really excited about it. And so that's when I
Hmm.
volunteered. I was like, look, I'm home with 2 kids. I think my parents had just arrived and could look after them for a couple of weeks. And so I was sort of itching to do something with my brain. And
Yeah.
that's
I
what I
could
said. Why
relate.
don't I come in and volunteer for a couple of weeks and see what I can do? And it was a good trial period for both of us, right? Like for him to see what I could do and for me to be like, is this something I'd want to spend some time on?
And so you had the spark, you'd already had kind of the early traction of working together. So you could sort of see what that could look like if you projected out. When
Yeah.
did the co-founder conversation come about? And I don't know, like walk us through, what did he say to you? If you
Yeah.
can think
Yeah.
back to that
So
moment.
yeah, the 2 weeks, sometime into the 2 weeks, it was going really well, so Andrew, just approached me to say, "Hey, I'd love to make this a bit more permanent." We hadn't raised any money yet, but I think we gave ourselves a bit of a deadline. This was the summer of
Yeah.
2014, and we said, "Hey, we're gonna be raising some money in the fall. Would you commit to," I think it was at the time we sort of thought, "another 3 months?" And so, yeah, I was, like, super excited, and again, I think being on mat leave, it was easier in that I didn't walk into a room and quit my job. I more made the phone call to say, "Hey, I don't think I'm gonna come back." And thankfully, my manager at the time said, "Totally get it. If this thing doesn't work out, let us know." And, they weren't necessarily holding my job for me, but, the door felt like it was open. So again,
De-risked.
yeah,
Totally.
it felt a little bit de-risked, and I do say this all the time that if entrepreneurship hadn't worked out, I would have found myself a job. Do you know what I mean? I do think a
Yeah.
lot of people think that they wouldn't say this explicitly, but I do think in the back of their minds, it's if this doesn't work and if I fail at this, it will somehow make
Yeah.
me unemployable for the rest of my life. And, there'll be this big failure. And so
Yeah.
to me, it did feel de-risked and that like I would just get a job if this didn't work out.
I love this mindset, by the way. This is really, and I talk to a lot of entrepreneurs and myself included, I get so wrapped up in my identity tied to what I'm doing. And so then if
Yeah.
something fails, and I have had something fail, a venture, you kind of feel inextricably linked to it. And so you feel like a failure. Meanwhile, if you actually
Yeah.
look at it objectively, there were so many things out of your control
Yeah.
that didn't necessarily show up. It wasn't necessarily what you did in your actions. And it's hard to
Yeah.
separate that sometimes. What I'm hearing from you is you kind of went into this with this experimental mindset of like, I'm going to show up curious. I'm going to keep learning. Learning seems to be a key theme and the way that
Yeah.
you relearn and keep
I think that's
accelerating.
right. Yeah, and
Yeah.
one thing I will say as an employer, if I see someone's been a founder before, that's a huge check mark. Whether
Yeah.
the venture was successful or not, I just recognize that person has experienced something, that they've got that founder mentality, they've got that sense of ownership, and so, yeah, it's, on the other side as an employer, I definitely look at that as a plus. But yeah, just
Yeah.
to go back to learning, I think that is something that throughout my career, I've been thrown into situations where I was the most junior person in the room, the youngest person in the room, often the only woman in the room, and the person with like the least experience. And so I started out my career as a management consultant, and by nature of the job, you're sort of plopped into an industry and a company that you don't know. So I do think that from early on in my career, I got pretty used to being uncomfortable and needing to ramp up
Mm,
pretty quickly. And I do
that's
give,
powerful.
yeah, that a lot of credit. So as a founder in those early days, I definitely was Googling things during meetings. Do you know what I mean? Like
Oh,
acronyms
yeah.
are being thrown around and I had no
Unit
idea what they
economics.
were. Yeah, all
Yeah.
these things. And so, but I was okay with that. And I do think that
Yeah.
that is a key to success. And I still remember, well, I joined Andrew alongside a Rotman MBA student who was there for a summer internship. And one of the comments he made to me is like, "Oh, Eva, you're not afraid to ask questions." And I thought that was like super interesting.
Superpower.
Yeah. And
Yes,
so that was definitely some of the consulting training that I'd had, which is like, if you don't know, you just ask.
completely.
I guess I hadn't
Yeah.
realized that like some people might hesitate to ask a question. And in my mind, I was like, well, if I don't ask a question, how am I going to learn?
Completely. And this is such a thread too, just coming back to where we are today, where knowledge is accessible because beyond Google, you now have an LLM in your pocket, you have an expert in your pocket
Yeah.
within reason. And now it's really all about how do we continue to relearn, right? And that is the skill versus knowledge. And now it's about judgment and making sure you can be thoughtful about that. Have you seen that in the way that you're thinking about AI in Borrowell and kind of the strategy for the business from a product perspective, people perspective, as something that has come through in the way you've built the culture as well?
Yeah, I think for sure. In that our view on AI internally is that this is a technology that's coming. And like many other things before it, there's a lot of things that I think are different about AI. Like many things before it, it's like we just have to experiment and learn, right? And
Yeah.
so I think that is like the primary thing is like we can't be scared of it. We have to learn it. This is coming, whether people like it or not. But for the most part, there's a ton of excitement around what it can do in terms of just accelerating our ability to do more for our members. So yeah, I think it's been exciting for sure. And it's opening up lots of new questions for us just in terms of, like what are things that people are expected and supposed to sort of like learn on their own and build on their own versus how can we support as an organization, maybe like an infrastructure layer and obviously establish some like principles and guidelines around safe AI use.
Yes. On that note, and I have a client, for example, who is, more in this sort of operations seat as a leader and is thinking about productivity as a team. And productivity
Yeah.
in knowledge work is challenging because, yeah, you could measure velocity of the engineering team or whatever, but ultimately it's like bits and bytes. It's not like we're like working with physical things necessarily. So I'm curious from an operating perspective, if you're thinking of the operations and helping everyone kind of upskill, if you will, with AI, do you have any guidance there? Even in like tools or frameworks or things that could just be really practical that a founder listening could take away and apply just to get started?
Yeah, for sure. This is something that we're wrestling with right now. Like, what are some of the metrics that we should be using? And I think some of the ones that we brainstormed around, like percentage of AI generated code, we're like, okay, well, maybe that was
Mm,
relevant pre agentic AI, but with agentic
yeah,
AI, maybe that's actually like not the right metric. So I do
right.
think that everyone sort of has to wrestle with this on their own, but maybe some principles. I do think
Yeah.
it's like, what is the goal, right? Like, is it operational efficiency? Are you trying to reduce cost? For us, that's not what it is. For us, it's much
Hmm.
more around like, how can we keep the same size team, but how can we do more? How can we accelerate what we're building? And so I think for us,
Love
it
that.
really is, it's that. And so, yeah, just sort of thinking through what that means for even like team structure. And we're like super early in that. But one of the ideas is like, do we repurpose some folks to be building internal tools or building some things? And again, super early. We haven't made any decisions around this, but yeah, I think there's like a lot of implications as we think about how we integrate AI into our work lives.
That's awesome. No, and I think that just that idea of what are the guardrails, what are the principles, and then letting people cook a little bit, letting people try things within those guardrails
Yeah.
makes a ton of sense, just given the pace of this. And textbooks are literally irrelevant a week after they're published, it
Yeah.
feels like.
Yeah.
And so, trial by doing and learning, relearning. We're going to kind of jump into kind of when you jumped in, you came into the business as co founder and COO, you raised money, and the product you built, the thing that you raised money for, isn't working. So, early days. My understanding is you launched with installment loans. And from what I read, you were literally rejecting every single application.
Maybe not
What
every
was
single
happening?
application, but
Okay,
definitely
okay.
way more than we thought we should. And
Right,
I think that's very
right.
normal for a lending business is that you like are very aware of the risk. And we had a chief risk officer who was great. He was also really thoughtful, right? And so, while we would cheer, it's like, yes, we put out a loan. His guidance was like, you don't celebrate when you put the money out, you celebrate as you get payments back, right? So just like the learning
Grounding.
about what some of the metrics are for a lending business. And so, yeah, I think we had a lot of debates in those early days around product market fit. Was it the product or were we being too tight or was it the market? Were we just like not doing a good job finding like the right people? And so there was this tension around whether the product needed to change or like the marketing needed to change. And yeah, it was definitely a struggle. And I think going back to the point around like, is it that we're not doing this well, or is this, a reflection of me personally or us personally as
Right.
individuals and as a team that we like just weren't doing the right things? So yeah, those early days were definitely a challenge.
That moment too, what's happening in the company and the external factors that you're seeing, and then the internal conversation that you're having with yourself. What was going on inside your head in the moment when you were like, is it me? Is it
Yeah.
us? Is it, yeah,
It's super stressful, right? And I do think the default is like, we're just not doing this right. Because on the outside, you're
yes,
reading all these success stories of other
yeah,
companies that are doing an amazing job, who are growing really quickly, who are raising more money. And I think you come to quickly realize that, of course, people are only talking about their successes. And it's more in the private rooms that founders are talking about their failures. And so a bit later, I was able to, I've been part of different founder groups, and those are amazing because I think for the most part, maybe the benefit is that you just recognize that all of this is completely normal. This,
yes.
things not working out the way that you expect them to. And I think that nowadays there's just like so much more in terms of content and podcasts and things like that. Like people recognize that product market fit is a process, right? You're not going to just launch something and expect it to work.
They
But I
will
think at the
come. Build it
time,
and they will
yeah,
come.
that's right. I think we had put a lot into the building of it, right? And we were pretty
Yeah.
excited about it, and the fact that it didn't work right out of the gate was, in hindsight, maybe naive, but, at the time felt like a failure.
And so you had raised money on this idea. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
And so you hit a moment where you're like, okay, free credit score is the idea. Who made the call to pivot to that? Where did that come from? And was there tension with your investors to make that shift?
Yeah, so I attended a conference, Andrew and I and some others, and I think that was like a real eye opener just to understand
Mm,
in other markets, there were similar companies to ours and how did they think about customer acquisition? And so I think we became aware of, in the US market, Australian market, UK market, that there were companies that focused on credit education and used free credit score as a real hook to help people understand their credit, but then also to understand that the financial products that they had maybe weren't the best ones for them at that time. The idea came from attending that conference. We came back, we discussed, the possibility of doing this. We spoke to Equifax. They were a great partner. And I think the thing that was helpful is that we didn't necessarily as a pivot. We launched it initially as a way to acquire customers for our loan product. And that
like
we
a lead
knew
magnet
it was
kind
a
of
lead
idea.
gen. Yeah, it was a
Yeah.
lead gen idea. But then we also did know that there was a possibility it would become its own business line, which is what happened. So for us, it wasn't really like sort of like a 90-degree pivot where we're like turning away from one thing to another. It was a more gradual thing where we layered on a second business that was actually lead gen for the loan business.
Yeah. And so you get to this point where this becomes the core business. And I'm curious when you're in a room making a decision to really go all in on another direction for the company, from that internal and external kind of dialogue in your head, how do you separate like this isn't working, we need to change more of the business side from like, and again, maybe this wasn't what you were feeling, but I've had this feeling of like, I'm not good enough to make this work. Like, I'm kind of wondering because some founders, I think, confuse that external signals from things aren't working because of external signals versus that internal dialogue. And you do need both to be able to have conviction in where you're going. I'm curious, like, sort of what you hear when you hear that.
Yeah. I would say that we've traditionally been bad at deciding not to do things. We've been pretty good about, well, good or bad, around spreading our bets around, which I don't think is the traditional
Hmm.
guidance. I think typically, especially when you're early stage and you've got a lean team, it's very much like pick a path and go after it. I don't know that that's necessarily what we did. We'd spread our bets sort of around three things. We had the loan business, we had our sort of like credit education, free credit score leading to a marketplace business. And then around that same time, we actually were launching a B2B business where we were powering a personal loan and then credit score for one of the big banks. And so we then had, a whole enterprise business as well, which I do not recommend for a company of, 20 people to be running three different businesses. It was a lot, but I think we were just we were worried about, not knowing which one would work. And I mean, eventually what happened was we placed our bets, we saw which grew fastest, and in the end there was a winner and we sort of gradually exited the other two businesses.
What did life look like when you were at that? number. And again, headcount can be a vanity metric. So the fact that
Yeah.
you had 20 people running 3 lines is also incredible. But from a time allocation perspective, like health, life, was it all consuming at that time just because it had to be?
Yeah, I think in the early days, it definitely felt all consuming. And when the team is small, like in the early days, is 4 people, it literally is if I didn't do something, it didn't get done. And so it
Yeah.
felt like, everyone had their stream. And so, everyone had
Yeah.
their workload. But for like the stuff that I was doing, if I didn't do it, it didn't get done. So I definitely felt that pressure. And meanwhile, I had 2 kids at home. I had a 4-year-old and a 1-year-old. And so it definitely felt like multiple shifts, right? I would come home from the
Yep.
work shift and then like another shift would begin. And I know you're in this sort of stage of life right now as well. I think I also didn't realize that this is a marathon. It's not a sprint. I was definitely going at sprint pace and not getting the
Mhm.
sleep I needed, not prioritizing my health. And I got pretty sick actually at the end of that first year. Nothing serious, but just like
Yeah.
literally,
Your body was like,
yeah,
hey, whoa,
pink
Eva.
eye in both eyes. I don't know if you knew that was
Oh,
possible. People always, it's singular, right? People
I've
call
seen
it pink
this.
eye, not pink eyes. Um, and I still remember, like, I was off for a little bit, but I went back into the office and people were like, please go home. Like, we do not want what you have. And so, but like,
This
it
is
was
what we
just,
do. This is
yeah,
what we do. And I have done this where I have literally been like, your brain being carried around by your body, like go, 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 go.
yeah,
Okay, so let's talk about when that shifted for you because I think a lot of founders in the build need to hear this in terms of that longer term thinking.
yeah,
And there, especially with AI, it does feel like this sense of like, we have to keep up. My goodness.
right.
When really, why do we go into these things? Why do we build? Why do we do the hard thing in the first place? For me, it's because eventually I would like time freedom. For me, it's because I want to make an impact on the world.
Yeah,
And I want to pick something that is meaningful enough to do that over a long enough period of time. But yet, we work within these very short term cycles. What's going on
yeah,
there, do you
yeah.
think?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that it comes from a good place, right? I think the motivation is like you're passionate about the business and you want to build it and you want it to be successful. And so I think it is more just like a framing of with a time horizon, as you were saying, right? We have to set ourselves up for a long term success, not just for short term success. So I
Yeah.
think that's been helpful is like in order to build what I want, in order to be in this for a long time, what structures and what boundaries do I need to put up? And I also do
Mm,
think in the early days, it's a lot of just like running the treadmill and not
yeah.
necessarily stepping back and being thoughtful around what actually matters here. Do you know what I mean? I think there's
Yeah.
very much this like do it all. And the things that are short term are easier to check off, right? So I think for a lot of
Yeah.
people who like love that, have a list, a to do list and check things off, it's easier with some of those things that are actually maybe not as valuable long term. So I do think
That's a
that
really
like,
good call.
yeah, stepping back and
Doing
just
more.
thinking about, yeah.
Doing
Well,
more
and
is
I,
not necessarily gonna lead to results. Spreading
yeah,
yourself
that's
too
right.
thin isn't necessary. When did you start to simplify? Because ultimately, to scale, in my experience, complexity happens, you start to grow so quickly, the wheels are coming off. You
Yeah.
hit product market fit, which you certainly did. First of all, what did that feel like in your body to be like, "Oh my god, whoa, it's working?" And second of
Yeah.
all, what did you do practically? If you were to think about the things that you did, 2 to 3 things to redesign around this for your
Yeah.
life so that the house you
Yeah.
built actually worked for you and you wanted to live in it.
Yeah.
What were those
Yeah.
things?
So for us, product market fit came pretty clearly. And I think that this isn't always the case, but when we launched credit scores for free, it was this thing where it's like it sort of took off right away. And so I remember we went on CBC News, we were on breakfast television. Like it was an exciting time
So cool.
because, yeah, I can't remember exactly the numbers, but thousands of people signed up in the first week or so. So, it definitely felt a little bit like we had hit the nail on something. And it was a super basic product, right? We literally showed you a 3-digit number and said, this is your credit score, which, it was. It just, like, we didn't give you really any context around the number other than maybe like what you have a 742 and it's good. And then we would update it in 3 months. So, very far from what we have today, which is free credit score, free credit, full credit report that we update on a weekly basis. But yeah, even that like very basic version of the product, people were coming for and they were really curious about what their credit score was. So
Mm,
yeah, that felt nice. And again, I don't think that's always the case, but for us, it's like, oh yeah, this felt a lot more like product market fit or that we had something here that came a little bit easier. So that was exciting. And then, yeah, to answer your question around like simplifying, I think it was around this time that we realized that as a organization, yeah, we weren't big at the time. We were maybe like 10 or 12 people. Then we did need to be thoughtful around what our goals were And so we did settle on OKRs as a goal setting framework. And that
Yeah.
was super helpful just to align and make sure we were all pulling in the same direction. Because again, you have all these people running this hamster wheel, like doing all these things that everyone thinks are good, but they may not be the best things. They may not be the most important things. And we just recognized that we all had to be aligned, pulling in the same direction. So I think that quarterly practice of taking a step back, thinking about what the most important things were, not just, everything that was good, which is not a high enough bar, was helpful for
Yeah.
us to be like, okay, this is what we say is important. And then we could evaluate decisions based on that.
And for you personally, was there any practices or things that you've put into your daily routine that allow you to show up differently than those early days? Because ultimately, we are paid for judgment at the end of the day. And so taking care of ourselves is really
Yeah.
important. And
Yeah.
I have lost sight of that in the past. I've
Yeah.
found my way back to it now out of, getting sick and having hard lessons. What's important to you? What's made a difference for you?
Well, around the time that we applied OKRs to work, I also really embraced OKRs even for my personal life. And I've maybe
Oh,
come of back of yeah. So
that's fun. We're
yeah, I'm
totally
one of
there.
those
Type A. Yeah.
one of those nerds for sure. And it was like, okay, well, if goal setting works for companies, and it should work here, where it's like being
Yeah.
transparent about the goal, being very like, specific and measurable, all those things. And so for me, like a big one has been sleep. It's
Yeah.
like if I want to get more sleep, I can't just say I want to get more sleep. I have to be very specific around what that looks like. And so it's like a bedtime that I
Yeah.
tried to stick to, right? And it meant like 30 minutes before that bedtime, I was going to be off screens and not get my brain going. Because in those early days with young kids, what happened a lot was come home, it's like the craziness of young kids, put them to bed, and then I would start work again. But
Yeah.
once I started work, my brain would get going. I wouldn't be tired. And
You're
I felt like I
firing.
could you're sort of like
Yeah.
firing on all cylinders.
And it's
And then,
quiet. It's like
yeah,
sacred time. No,
yeah,
I'm in this a little
yeah,
bit. So
yeah.
did
But
you
then it
find you had to
wouldn't
just kind of
be, like I wouldn't be able to get to sleep, right? And then the next morning. And so you get into this like vicious cycle.
yeah. And so how did you
So
get out of it? Did you just have to say, "I'm no longer
yeah, I think
doing
it
this"?
was more just like, okay, there is a certain bedtime. I am gonna like turn screens off at a certain time, even if I'm feeling
Yeah.
super productive, even if like my inbox, I'm like so close to getting my inbox cleared. Cause again, it's like one of those things where it feels good to check that off. But I just came to realize that like if I kept on going that way, I wouldn't be able to do it again like that many nights in a row because I still had to get up early the next day. So yeah,
Totally.
I think again, it's just like
Sleep,
setting,
foundation.
yeah, yeah,
Foundation and being intentional about where you're going and making sure everyone's rolling in the same direction.
yeah.
And likely, like, if you were to say, "Hey, this number is a really healthy company level number of OKRs," what would you say the maximum should be? Because I find a lot of folks are like, "Let me do it all," and it's out of fear of like, if I don't do it all, I may
Yeah.
miss something. Versus
Yeah.
going, no, if we radically focus, we're going to get a better result because everyone's going to be clear. If you ask anyone in the org, this is what we're focused on. What's that
Yeah.
number for you? Is there a number?
Yeah. So we typically have 3 objectives, and within
Nice.
each objective, we'll have 1 to 3 key results. I think actually this is like a good reminder. I think we are slightly over that. But I do think that a good test is like, can you remember them? Right? If I can't even remember
Yes.
them, then that's a
Yes.
problem. And, pick a person in an organization. Could they come back with like 80% of them? Do you know what I mean? And so for us, like, we
That's
have
it.
typically we have some sort of like revenue and profitability metric. And so those are always there. Those are important, but those are maybe a bit of a given. But yeah, can people actually remember what the other ones are?
In terms of, where you are now. So absolutely this idea of focus. And I really love the power of three. It's so simple, probably back to consulting days for both of us, but that is,
Right.
there's only so much we can retain. And so much of leadership, especially when you're at the scale you're at, is in narrative and storytelling to really help hone in the clarity of what that individual needs to do and how that ties up to what the company needs to do. And then everything's just kind of rolling in alignment. Not always, but this is the goal. This is the goal. And so I'm curious, just in terms of, you go out there and you see an opportunity to grow inorganically through an acquisition that is Refresh Financial. Can you tell us a little bit about what that was like, whatever you are able to share in terms of
Yeah.
being on the buyer side and then going,
Yeah.
well, we're going to be able to accelerate through this path, which a lot of Canadian companies need to hear. You can be the buyer too. That's
Yes. Yeah.
possible.
Yeah, I do remember at the time I referenced this group of founders and I mentioned, hey, we're like potentially going through an acquisition. Just do people have advice? And the default, everyone just thought we were being required, not that we were actually the acquiring company. So yeah, I do
That
think
is the
that maybe
default
we don't. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
for now. For now.
So we were at the time maybe 50 people, and Refresh was actually a larger organization than we were in terms of like headcount, but they were a company that we partnered with for a long time. And so we offered their credit building product and their secure card as part of our marketplace. And we didn't realize this at the time, but we were one of their major acquisition channels. And
Mm.
so at the time we were thinking about growth and, what new product we might build. And we had both this credit builder product as well as secured card on our roadmap of things that we could potentially build ourselves. So I do think this is the natural. It's like, should we build this? Should we like partner? Should we buy? And again, because we had this really strong relationship with Refresh, we had different conversations and sort of one thing led to another. And yeah, there was like a lot of openness for on the other side to merge the two companies. And it was super exciting. I think, to go through an acquisition, whether you're an acquirer or you're, like whichever side you're on, I do think it's a cool sort of, check mark on the professional resume. And so there's definitely like learnings there. And overall, yeah, it was really exciting. And I think for us, the fact that it was similar sized also made it interesting. And the fact that we were doing this through COVID. So
Oh, yes.
yeah,
2020. And
definitely
you were
exciting
running
milestone for the
diligence through
company.
COVID. So
Yeah.
interesting. What was it from the way that you looked at the acquisition? Because there's sort of a shift that happens when you go from founder to buyer hat. What did that shift look like for you inside your head? Like, how did you evaluate? What did you look at? What was important to you? The buyer
Yeah.
perspective.
For us, the fact that it was an established product, that they had a lot of expertise in this was helpful, that they had obviously like sort of a book of business. Yeah, I think there were a lot of check marks there that just felt like we could accelerate rather than starting from scratch on our own. And in this
Yeah.
business, it is all around speed. And so, yeah, I think that was definitely a big plus is that we were acquiring a going concern and a business that was already doing well and had a bunch of traction. So, and then quickly, I think we were thinking just around the integration and what does it look like to successfully combine these two companies? Because you hear so many stories where it's
Oh,
not
yeah.
just about getting the acquisition done, which is a challenge in and of itself because there's so many things that could derail it. But it's actually, successfully integrating and growing the business together. So, I mean, even maybe before it was done, we were thinking really thoughtfully around how do we make sure that we can successfully integrate these two businesses from like a cultural and operational level.
What would be your playbook, if you will? I mean, just high level things that you think a founder, maybe blind spots that you think folks miss when integrating. And I've been involved in 4 acquisitions in a year and I was COO and I had to integrate them. And for people listening, yes, there's software, but at this stage, while AI agents can code, this is people. This is
Yeah.
people for sure in terms of how do we harmonize, bring folks together and design it well so that everyone
Yeah.
can kind of rise. What are
Yeah,
the
one
blind
of the
spots?
things that we did early on was we hadn't refreshed our values in a while. And so we took this opportunity to do a joint exercise of like, what are our values? We like looked
Oh,
at the
neat.
refresh ones, we looked at the Borrowell ones, but we did take a step back just to say, like, what kind of company do we want to build together? I think doing that kind of exercise with everyone having, an equal say and to contribute. In the end, obviously, it's like as co-founders, we're the ones that are making the decision and we have to own that. But I think, doing that kinds of joint exercises around like what kind of company do we want to be and involving everyone in that conversation, I think was foundational and helpful.
And were they running on the same sort of systems in terms of OKR performance setting? Was there any complexity that you had to really design to integrate well?
Yeah, I don't recall whether they were using the framework before, but yeah, I think for us it was in a way like the fact that it was COVID was easier in some ways, and that it wasn't like there was the Borrowell team in the office in Toronto, and then Refresh is based in Kelowna in BC. The fact that everyone was online, I think was helpful
That's
because
nice.
then everyone was a square on a screen. And I think typically with hybrid meetings, the people sort of in person feel like they've got the bulk of it and it's not as good an experience for people who are joining online. So yeah, I think there were some things like that that we didn't think about, but just sort of happened that I do think were helpful to like equalize and make sure that no one sort of felt like a secondary citizen.
So culture is what I'm hearing, just that people focus and making sure that you really design the house together, if you will. I really do think of
Yeah.
companies like houses. It's really helpful, especially when you're thinking about enterprise value. It's like, do I do the kitchen remodel and does that add value when we go to sell,
Mm.
if we go to sell, right? So designing it together, building it together. And then I'm curious for you personally, how does it change or how had that experience changed the way you think about growth and building value in the company?
Maybe as someone who's a builder, you always default to building yourself first. And I know whenever I hear about
Yeah.
other companies that are either, it's like they've launched a new feature and then you sort of find out afterwards that they actually didn't build it themselves. They hired an agency or they had outside help. It's always a bit of a surprise to me. So I think it is just like helpful to
Yeah.
recognize that like you don't have to build everything yourself. You can partner, you can white label, and you can acquire, and that it's another tool in the toolkit, right? And so I think sometimes the default is always like, oh, you know, we have to build it ourselves, otherwise it's cheating. It's like, obviously it's not cheating.
Totally. Well, yeah, it's that
Yeah.
kind of like that founder, I'm going to do it
Yeah.
versus, the moment you realize that you're going to not be able to scale beyond yourself if that is your mindset. And so
Yeah.
looking to that. The other thing too is how long was that relationship kind of in the works before the acquisition? Was it a number of years, a
Yeah.
year? Like what
Yeah.
was
We've
sort of,
been working together for a number of years
yeah,
before the acquisition. So we definitely like, knew each other
see,
and knew the team. Yeah. Knew the leadership.
people buy from people, and this includes companies. And for founders listening, this partnership to acquisition strategy can be a strategy. Thinking about
Yeah.
early your end game, where you want to go with the business, whether that is an external sale, thinking through your universe of potential buyers is actually the inverse, thinking through the potential universe of ecosystem partnerships, how that helps you both grow. So then there's business cases on both sides because you already have the data to go, oh, we're their number one acquisition source. Interesting. Oh, they have products we don't have, similar customer base. There's a really nice alignment there. And I think that it's just really helpful to think through that
Yeah. For
that
sure.
way. Not that it has to be so strategically designed. You probably didn't know when you partnered that this would be a
No, we
potential
didn't. Yeah.
path.
We didn't.
You're now at this incredible scale. You've been on this incredible ride that you jumped into. Is the self-doubt still there even now? Do you have moments of doubt at this scale?
For sure. But I don't think it's there the same way. And because I do
Yeah.
think maybe too many founders have too much self doubt. So I don't think about it a ton,
Mm,
to be honest.
yeah.
But I do think that maybe in a similar vein, even though I'm not thinking about it, is it somehow in the back of my head that like, this is all I can do? And so I do think it's important
Mm,
for me to like challenge myself around like, no, 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 there's definitely still more. And so, while, yeah, I don't think I have those moments of self doubt the same way explicitly. I wonder if, like,
yeah.
implicitly it holds me back from thinking bigger than I should. And I feel like
Mm,
this is where my co founder is really great. He's always like sort of pushing us to be more ambitious and think bigger. And I really appreciate that because, again, even though it's not explicit, I wonder if sometimes there's an implicit thing around, like, oh, yeah, I'll just grow this a little bit farther than I am today, as opposed to thinking about it in a more ambitious way.
well, I think that's a really helpful frame, especially too, just for women founders too. I do feel like when I was out pitching in California, I was pitching a very similar business to others. And I think just your conviction is so important, but also recognizing that I'm speaking to me here, but past me, like you are enough. And frankly, your imagination is your limit when it comes to what you can build with software today. And ultimately, you did push it, you did go after it. And I've heard and seen, and we talked about kind of like you choose the things that scare you a little bit and you lean into it and you learn
Yeah.
and you grow. And the result is here. And I do wonder if doubt starts to fade away once you see the snowball of all the traction and momentum, and then you kind of arrive. But you haven't arrived. And when we started this conversation, I was like, hey, like it must be great. And because you're on the next milestone, you're on the next.
Yeah.
So what would be your advice for founders who are so heads down in the build to just kind of look up and I don't know, look at what they've built so far?
Yeah. I do
It's hard to do.
find, yeah, we do quarterly board meetings, like I'm sure many companies do. And I do find those helpful because you sort of look back over the quarter. It doesn't even have to be a board meeting, just as sort of as we do our quarterly OKRs, as we look back, it is exciting to think about what we've built. And as we look forward, we're always like so excited to be like, oh, I can't wait till we've actually, achieved these. So I do think some of that goal setting is helpful. And for sure, we need to do more celebrating of what we have achieved. But yeah, I think it's a balance, right? Do you want to celebrate what you've achieved, but you still want to keep pushing and,
Hold that
and
tension.
yeah, to hold that. for sure.
Totally. No, and I think there is so much to celebrate, but there's also so much more impact that you have on the horizon and such an important space and such an important economic time for Canadians,
Yeah,
especially just to be able
for
to
sure.
have these tools. So, last question for you. If you think about a founder sitting in front of you who, maybe hasn't started the thing, or maybe they're in the thing, but they're still feeling like they maybe don't belong in some of these rooms, or they're not a tech founder, so therefore, they're out of the loop, what have you. What advice would you say to someone who's feeling like maybe they're not enough for the role they're in?
I have a 15-year-old son, and I am really amazed at the amount of confidence he has, given that he's 15 years old, right? He's a very confident, intelligent guy, but he literally has only been on this earth for 15 years. And I look at him and his friends, this is the amount of confidence they have around what they can do and what that enables them to do. And
Mm,
so I think my advice is to channel the confidence and energy of a 15-year-old boy because they really believe they can do anything and they've done
that's
nothing.
good.
God bless.
Hear this, hear
Yeah.
this. Any founder, and specifically women founders too. And I'm not saying but this was my experience as well. And I heard this the other day, Eva. Kristen, and this is just in a book I was reading, Tiny Experiments. I don't know if you've read it. It's fantastic about how to adopt more of an experimental mindset. But everyone you're worried about and thinking about what they're going to think of you or what have you is going to die within the next 100 years. And so are you. So get out there, do the thing, and don't worry
Yeah.
about it. Don't sweat it.
Yeah.
And I
I
love
love
your
that.
mental model of your son and the
Yeah.
confidence there. Well, hey,
Yeah.
thank you so much, Eva, for being on the show and appreciate you. Cannot wait. Where can folks find out more about Borrowell and you?
For sure, they can go to borrowell.com or you can download the Borrowell app. And I think that's, to take your advice and apply it to personal finance, which is also an area that sometimes people feel like they don't know what the next step is. I would just do one thing, right? And maybe it's find out what your credit score is if you don't know it today. I think just take the step, do the thing. I love that advice.
Love it. Thank you so much.